It's like 6 in the morning and I feel like I look a little disheveled, but we're gonna roll with the punches. And I'm very excited because today I have my 8th update in my No Pan Left Behind series, and today is a very special video because we're bringing back a project that I never thought I would do again, and that is Pan That Palette. I have been hemming and hawing about wanting to bring this project back in some capacity, specifically because there's one palette that I don't feel in my heart I can declutter unless I've literally made an effort to like actually just use the palette up. Can you guess what it is? Pause the video. I'm not gonna put it in the thumbnail, so pause the video and guess which palette is going to be the Pan That palette. Oh wait, actually I'll just share it at the end of the video, and I'm not going to spoil anything, but at the end of the video I'm going to be sharing what my Pan That palette is going to be. I'm not going to put as much pressure on myself to like finish this palette in any given time, and I'm not going to do monthly updates. I think I'm going to do bi-monthly updates, and if bi-monthly updates still are not producing a ton of progress, then I might do quarterly updates. I don't really care if I finish this palette. I don't plan to actually finish the whole palette, but I don't really like, I'm not putting like a 12-month timeline on it. I just want to encourage myself to use this palette up in all of the capacity that I want to, so that I feel in my heart that I'm ready to let go when it's time to let go. And then in terms of No Pan Left Behind, I do have 2 palettes that I have decided I am going to be decluttering. I have 1 palette in this project that I have completed and will be rolling out, and I have 6 additional palettes that I've completed No Pan Left Behind. So I feel like it was a very successful eyeshadow completing period. Although I wasn't doing my makeup that much in August, the tail end of August and the first few days of September, I have done my makeup for work, and then like I come home and football season has started, so I've been like doing my makeup, like redoing my makeup just while I watch a football game, just for fun. So we have quite a few completed palettes, which I'm very excited to share with you. So if you are interested in seeing what palettes I've completed, what palettes I'm decluttering, and what will be my Pan That palette, stay tuned. For if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project panning content, palette themed content, or just chit-chatting about makeup, I'd love for you to consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. Can I just say how happy my soul is to like have blue eyeshadow on again? Like, I just freaking love a blue eyeshadow. So, not that I couldn't wear blue any other time of the year, but it's been a bit. Okay, I'm gonna save my Pan That palette introduction until the tail end. And I always like to start my No Pan Left Behind by just sharing with you any palettes that I completed outside of this project. So like I said, I have 7 to share with you, and this will be a spoiler for, I think my deck of panning is what I rolled this in for, but I did complete the Ensley Rain Flourish palette, No Pan Left Behind style. I will say, so I'll always share pictures off to the side here of the looks that I created. There was one day I was trying to recreate a look that I saw using a ton of color, and I just was not loving the way that it turned out. So sometimes I will, like if I'm just playing around with makeup, I'll almost always like do my full face of makeup, but I always do my eyeshadow first. And I wasn't loving the way this look turned out, so I didn't end up doing like the rest of my face of makeup, but I still took a picture just so you knew that I was playing around with the colors. Now I will say, I really enjoy this palette. It's not going to be my most used palette, especially like the matte shades. It's just not going to be my most reached for palette of all time, because it is quite colorful and not something that I personally feel confident wearing on an everyday basis. I'm thinking to like work. I think my patients at work would kind of look at me and be like, oh, hot pink eyeshadow today? Okay, girl. They probably would actually be okay with it, but like for me, I just feel like I'm not going to be wearing hot pink eyeshadow to work. So that being said, it's metallic special shades in this palette, like if I were to do a neutral look and then just pop like one of these metallics on, yes, I would be like gleaming to the gods. But I do feel like confident and comfortable wearing like a neutral look with like a very punchy like metallic on the lid. I feel fine with that. And Ensley Rain makes my absolute favorite special shades. They have so many different finishes, so many beautiful textures, and their special shades are just so impactful on the eyes. Like I just cannot. Even the shade Dahlia Magic right here, which is this red shade, is not a shade that I personally would find myself gravitating towards, but this is so freaking pretty on the eyes. I absolutely love it. I know that many were asking Ensley Rain for smaller palettes, and they did deliver. I still need to finish, not the Flourish, the Flutter palette, which I'm so excited for because it's like, oh, blues in there, blue special shades, but it's like a grungy fall dream, so I'm very excited to complete that palette. The neons, I do find that I would, like, I think I'll get used out of them again come next summer, and I love that we have this pale yellow, like on the inner corner, this pale yellow, so, so, so pretty. I mean, I probably have a hot pink elsewhere in my collection, but I don't really have anything like this shade Thistle, which I have to actually share this story because anytime I think of thistles, I think of one college night. One of my best friends from like high school, her and I lived together in college, and a bunch of us were out and about on like a Friday or a Saturday night. We were having a few drinks, having a little bit of fun, and then we're walking home, and one of my best friends literally falls. Literally falls. We're so close to home. We're literally like on the block our house was, but just like across the street. She falls, and she had maybe like a couple too many beverages, was like struggling to kind of like right herself or like get herself up, and where she fell, she kept like grabbing onto a thistle, which I'm sure you guys know what a thistle is, but it's a very spiky pointy thing, and it like hurts. So she's like literally like trying to get up, grabbing at this thistle and being like, oh, it hurts so bad. And anytime I think of thistles, I think of that, but I also don't think of a thistle as being like this really beautiful purple, but I don't think I have a shade like this in any other palette of mine. So I do find like some of the shades in this to be quite unique. I love the color. It's just not something I'm going to be wearing on an everyday basis. However, these special shades I absolutely would wear on an everyday basis. The only one I think I wouldn't potentially would be this Garden Glow, and that's just because I don't always love a mint on my eyelids. But everything else I'm freaking obsessed with. Fairy Flutter is this really beautiful kind of bronzy, like orange golden, just holographic, really shifty shade. It's so pretty. I've literally been talking about this palette what feels like 7 minutes at this point, so I should shut up and just let you know this is complete. Just last night I completed the Glaminatrix Cosmetics Barely Basic palette. Let me just say, when I saw like the first teaser photo of this, like there wasn't even a doubt in my mind. Like I was like, I must have this palette. Everything about this I love. I love the way that the palette is laid out. So if you are someone who doesn't like to like be creative and really like think through a look, you just want something like easily laid out for you, you can literally just follow the rows of shadows, and that is exactly what I did. I created 4 looks with this palette in order to complete it, and I literally just followed the rows for each look. I think these first 2 are my favorite. I will say this last row, I'm not a huge fan of these 2 mattes. I found those a little bit more difficult to work with. I will also note that I'm not someone who like a gray, like really cool tone smoky eye is not necessarily my everyday go-to. So in terms of like comfort level, that could also be the case. But the shade Follow is such a beautiful, like, I don't know if this is a holographic shade, but I personally would kind of consider it holographic. It's this really beautiful, intense, golden, like greeny sort of shift on the eyes. It's so pretty. I do really enjoy all the looks. I will say this is probably this row was my least favorite look, but I really enjoyed all the looks that I created with this. The one other thing I will note is I was kind of surprised these 2 like special shades. This is definitely more of like a red, which is totally fine, but like, I don't know, there was something about, like, I wish there was something just maybe like a little bit more bronzy for this row, but it is what it is, and I'm totally fine with that. I love the iridescent topper shades, like so freaking pretty. I love the Glaminatrix formula, both their mattes and their special shades. So I highly recommend this palette, and I really enjoyed my time testing that out. I did finally finish my Diverune Cosmetics Moth and Moon palette. This took me a while to complete. I think part of that is just like the color story kind of throws me off. I really like the Diverune special formula. Their mattes are okay in my opinion. I definitely think that there is room for improvement in some of their mattes. I felt the exact same way with the Gloomy Gardens palette. This shade right here did come shattered, so I had to repress it in. That's why there's a bit of a pan in there. I will also say this shadow is like extremely extremely like loosely pressed, so there's a lot of kick up, a lot of fallout, so you kind of have to be careful there. I also think Dieverune makes an incredible special shade. They have a bunch of different textures and finishes. Their holographic shades are so intense on the eyes. This shade right here, as well as this shade down here, so intense on the eyes. I really like, again, Diverune's special shades. I think there's something to be desired in their matte shades. The color story doesn't necessarily speak to me, but I'm still so happy to have the top row of shades in this palette that I'm not mad at it. But if you're not someone who likes something super punchy and metallic on the eyes, I don't necessarily know that I would recommend this palette unless, like, I guess the color story spoke to you. But for me, I found the color story a little bit difficult to work with and just like come up with looks in my mind just the way that I typically work. So is this going to be my absolute favorite palette in my collection? No. I likely would reach for my Ensley Rain palettes and a couple other palettes over this one, but I still am just so happy to have the top row that, like, I still think this is worth the purchase in my opinion. I did also finally complete the Natasha Denona Golden palette. I don't know why this took me so long to complete, probably because I will say in August, like, my days that I wore like makeup to work, which was, I mean, I wear makeup every day to work, but there's some days where like I really just do like one shadow on the lid and that's really it. And that was kind of my August. Like, I feel like I was just kind of in a rush the entirety of August. And then when I sat down to actually play with makeup, like when I film, I like to play with things that like maybe I wouldn't wear to work because I'm not off to work, whereas this would be a very work appropriate look or work appropriate palette for me. So it just took me a little bit longer to finish this. I think this is absolutely beautiful. Now, I do have the Natasha Denona Gold palette, which is a favorite palette in my collection. So some of these shades I already have, and I knew that going into purchasing this. In fact, earlier this year, I said, wouldn't it be great if Natasha Denona made the gold palette, like brought it back, but brought it back in a midi? The one thing I will say, and I think I've heard this feedback from others, is I wish that she would at least have included the, I think it's like no, it's not sandstone. Sandstone is a matte. The lime chrome. Would have loved if she would have included that, as well as the other kind of like greeny shade, and maybe like one pop of the teal. Like, I feel like we could have added just a little something more to make this just a little more special. But overall, this is a wonderful everyday palette. Like, I feel like this is a very utilitarian, easy palette to work with. You don't have to think too hard. You're gonna get a beautiful look. The quality is good, and I'm happy to have this in my collection. In my whole collection project pan, I did roll in the Too Faced Born This Way Natural Nudes palette. I recently shared an update on this palette, and I let you guys know that I have completed this. No pan left behind, so kind of a repeat if you saw that update, but I will share the looks that I created with this palette as well. And what I did say in my whole collection project pan is this is a palette that kind of was on the chopping block for me. And that could just be because I've had it in my collection for a bit. I'm someone who isn't very patient, gets a little bit bored. So if things have been kind of in my collection, even if it's something I've like loved, if it's been in my collection for a bit, I'm like, I feel like I'm kind of over you. So I kind of got that feeling about this palette. But then when I completed it, no pan left behind style, I was reminded as to how many different looks I can create with this. It is kind of a utilitarian palette too, a great palette to travel with because it does provide many different options. Like, you have neutral shades, you have dusty pinks, you have these really warm browns. You can do a lot with this palette, and I enjoyed my time with this. So happy to have completed that. And then finally, I wasn't necessarily like set out to complete this palette. This is the Glaminatrix Nearly Natural palette, another absolute favorite palette in my collection, my favorite Glaminatrix palette for sure. But I brought this with me to Chicago when my daughter and I went, and by the time we left Chicago, I had already used the majority of these shades. So when we got back, I was like, well, why don't I just complete this so that I can have another completed palette? I love using this palette, so it's not going to be like a chore to use. And so that is exactly what I did, and I was just reminded as to how much I love this palette. I did a look using the shade Stripped Back, which is this really beautiful kind of, it looks almost like a blue in the palette, but it really does read more like silver on the eyes. It's kind of like a blue silver, but I paired it with the shade Nearly Natural, which is this pink. That wasn't what I necessarily intended to do when I started to create the look. I was planning to use the shade Naked Eye, but mixing the like silver and the pink with like this little bit of a blue hue, I absolutely loved the look that I created with that. One thing I've said in the past about Glaminatrix mattes, and I continue to feel the same, especially like considering like Barely Basic, is their matte shadows are definitely a little bit more buildable, which actually works really well for me. Yes, it takes me a little bit more time maybe to create my look, but I am someone who can be pretty heavy-handed with their makeup. I also have like a really interesting eye shape. I feel like I have really deep set hooded eyes, and I just get so frustrated creating eye looks. So sometimes not having like the most pigmented shades right off the bat works really well, and it's something I continue to enjoy about the Glaminatrix palette. I really wish that they would bring this palette back. I feel like there's so many people with FOMO over not purchasing this palette. Like, the palette will sell. Like, even like an everyday, like, doesn't even watch YouTube, if they somehow stumbled upon an ad for this or the Glaminatrix website, like, if I wasn't on YouTube, I would think this is a beautiful palette still and I would purchase it. So they really should bring this back. So those were all of the palettes I completed outside of this palette. As I mentioned, I have completed one palette inside of this project, and that is my Janessa Myrix Lightwork Volume 3 palette. This is what this palette looks like. This is, I feel like, the palette that kind of made me want to dabble more in indie. This palette I fell in love with, and ever since I've been purchasing all of the Janessa Myrix Groundworks palette. I did just purchase Groundwork 6. I will say, initially when I saw it, I was like, maybe I don't need this. It could be that I was feeling like a little bit poor after just getting home from Chicago. I was like, maybe I don't need this, but then I was like, girly, yes you do. And then the more I've looked at swatches, I'm like, okay, it looks so freaking beautiful. It's supposed to arrive in just a few days. By the time this video goes up, maybe I've already gotten it, but I'm so excited to play around with that one. This I absolutely love. I feel like this palette is so unique in that you can really layer some of these shades. Like, the shade Polaris is this really beautiful cream shadow that gives this like iridescent green finish, but you can layer these shades on top of it to really create more than just the 8 shades provided, and it's so beautiful. I found this past month that I really like the shade Aurora as like a lower lash line shadow. By the way, I think my daughter may have accidentally scratched Aurora, so I have a pan there. And I also have a pan in the shade Polaris. Like, I love this palette. I have raved about this palette since I got it. I was so excited to roll this into this project, and even rolling it out, it's something I anticipate I will continue to reach for. Within this project, I ended up reaching for this palette a total of 7 times. I reached for the shade Polaris actually only once, which is really shocking for me, and I swear I reached for it more. I reached for the shade Galaxy 1 time. The shade Martian I reached for twice. Soul I reached for once. And then I reached for Strawberry Moon twice down here. I reached for Aurora twice. Gaia? I don't know how to say this one. I reached for 1 time, and then Solarian I reached for twice. So I reached for many of these shades more than just 1 time, and as I said, this is something I anticipate I will continue to reach for. Even the shade Martian, I topped just a little bit of Martian on my look today just to kind of like tie everything together. I feel like this is such a perfect blue shade, kind of like a lid topper shade, to just maybe tie a blue look together that you feel like looks, I don't want to say not as blended out as you want, but just to kind of like bring things together. I really love that shade Martian. As I said, I love Polaris. Strawberry Moon I've used as a topper to kind of bring purple looks together. So very excited to have completed this palette. And that brings me to the rest of the palettes, which I was not great about this project, I will say. So we can start with the palette that I didn't reach for at all. I rolled in this palette last month. This is the Sugar Pill Fun Size palette. I have actually completed this palette before No Pan Left Behind style in years past, but I rolled this in again and I didn't reach for it even 1 time. Now, I do love this palette. It's not like I'm thinking about decluttering it, but I just did not reach for that. So that is going to remain in the project. And then I also did choose. So I have 5 palettes that are randomly selected, and then I choose 1 palette for myself to work on in this project. I did choose the Clarity So Amazing palette to work on, and I didn't reach for this even 1 time either. This is a larger palette, so not a great palette to travel with, and then I just really was not thinking about it. So this one I am going to keep in the project, even though it is definitely more like spring summer in my opinion, but I really want to complete this palette because I'm not sure if I just love the shimmers and not the mattes, or like, do I feel like the palette is something that I want to use as a whole? I honestly don't know, so hopefully we'll find out. Hopefully I will actually complete that. All right, then I have the Huda Wild Tiger palette, which I haven't yet completed. I have reached for this a total of 3 times since rolling it into this project, and I have reached for this shade right here 3 total times. I really like this bronzy like chunkier metallic that has some pink shimmer in it. I don't know what it is about the shade, but I absolutely love it. And then I've also reached for the middle shade, which is this really beautiful pink to gold duochrome. I've reached for that one time. Aside from that, I haven't reached for anything else, but I am going to be doing a palette bingo alongside some other ladies. So this I anticipate will be a completed palette by next update, just not this update. And then the final two palettes I have to share are both going to be declutters. So if you've been following this project, you may be thinking to yourself, hey, there's that Glaminatrix cake palette that's been in since the introduction. Every month you say, I need to use it, or I'm going to declutter it, I need to use it. And I've finally come to terms with the fact that I think I just don't need this palette in my life anymore. That is not to say this is not a great palette. I think this is a great palette, but I have been trying to no pan left behind this since the introduction, since January, and I've reached for this to create one look. Like, I've literally reached into this palette one time this year, and if I were to, like, the easiest time of year for me to finish this would have been the summer, because summer I typically is the time that I'm reaching for more bright, colorful, fun looks. I did not do that. So I think there's a handful of shades throughout this palette that are unique to my collection. However, even being unique to my collection, I'm just not reaching for this palette. Why am I keeping it? I brought so many indie palettes into my collection the last year to 2 years that's offering me color that I clearly reach for more frequently than I'm reaching for these shades. So I'd rather just pass this along to a color lover who's actually going to use this, rather than let it just sit in their collection for so long. I feel like I've kept this because I'm like, it's a nice rainbow palette. So if I wanted to create a really colorful look, I have the shades I want in here, but I'm never creating a rainbow on my lids. I'm not using it. So I'm gonna pass this one along. And then the final palette is my Too Faced Pumpkin Spice palette. And I used almost every shade in this palette, and then I don't know where the palette is. I like set it aside in like a I'm thinking of decluttering bin. Like, my apartment's so messy right now, but I set it aside and I literally can't find it. I'm sure it'll pop up, but this is something that I was like, I should keep this because I love pumpkin spice things, or I love pumpkin. I'm a basic bitch. I like fall. But I just have palettes that I would rather be reaching for over this. So keeping it in my collection is just like adding another choice, just making the decision harder each day. And not because I want to be reaching for the palette, like not because like it's in the lineup of things I want to reach for. It's there and it's making me feel guilty that I'm neglecting it. So I'm like, why am I keeping this? I don't need to keep it. I don't need to keep things in my collection that I'm not excited to reach for. And that just ended up being, I found through using the palette No Pan Left Behind style, it's just one of those palettes. And I think I used to really like this palette. I really loved it when I first got it. But as I've purchased more indie and as I've played around with more indie palettes, I just don't like the palette as much, and that's okay. That is okay. More things have come out. I've tried different formulas that I like better, and I'm ready to move on from that palette. So that is precisely what we are gonna do. And that means we have 3 palettes that will be exiting this project. So we have the Janessa Myrix, and then we have the 2 declutters. So the Glaminatrix Cake and the Too Faced Pumpkin Spice. Now, all 3 of those palettes were rolled in from my wheel. So all 3 palettes that are entering this project are going to be selected off of my random wheel. So I'm gonna go grab that, but before I do, I just wanna note all of my stats will be in the description box down below. So the number of pans that I've hit this year, the number of completed shadows, so meaning I used up an entire pan of eyeshadow, and then also the number of completed palettes, which I believe I'm at 57 completed eyeshadow palettes, no pan left behind, which honestly feels really good. I'd love to get to even 75 by the end of the year. That would feel like an accomplishment because that would be about half of my palette collection. So fingers crossed we're able to do that. But let me go grab my wheel and I'll be right back. All right, my palette wheel is set to no repeats, basically has been the whole year. So anything that's rolled in this year won't repeat. The only palettes not on this list would be palettes that are new to my collection this year in 2024. However, in order for me to finish testing a palette, I have to complete it no pan left behind anyway. So that's why I don't include new palettes that have come in this year. I've turned my sound down so it can be a little bit more fun. And let's roll in. Can we turn the sound up? Ah! Oops, I accidentally turned my phone off. Glaminatrix ScoobyDoo. Oh, well, I thought unless it's ScoobyDoo 2. because I feel like the regular Glamlight Scooby-Doo has already been rolled in this year and it is set to no repeat. I guess Glamlight Scooby-Doo 2 is going to be the one we roll in because I have decluttered Glamlight Scooby-Doo. All right, palette number 2. I see that I've not taken off my declutter palettes. This is the Oma Beauty Coming to America palette, which I have decluttered. So we are going to spin again. Vizier Soleil Le Plug, which I chose as a palette. How does this happen? So that one is not eligible because I have already completed that. The reason it rolled is because it hasn't been rolled off this wheel, but I picked it. Colourpop The Child. Also decluttered. My goodness, I am not looking like a YouTuber that has her life together. Natasha Denona Mini Gold. Also a declutter. How does this happen? I truly don't understand. Natasha Denona Lila, which I just rolled in to my whole collection project pan. Rolling again. Now I forgot. Oh, Glamlight Scooby-Doo. Nabla Nude. Also a declutter. How? Be something I haven't used. Ooh, Rowan 1111. I have completed this. This is already completed palette, so I feel like I should re-roll. Oh my gosh. I literally don't get it. Nars Rising Star, which I believe is like I think it's the one with the stars on the cover. I actually think it's like, anyway, that one I haven't finished. That's perfect. That is perfect. Great. Huda Python. Ooh, I'm gonna roll that one in. I did just roll in like all of my Huda mini palettes to my graveyard project pan, and I said I wanted to complete them all, no pan left behind, but I feel like this will, like, putting in this project will motivate me to actually complete that one. So I'm gonna grab all those. I'll be right back. Have the palettes. Up first, we have the Glamlight Scooby-Doo palette. Now this is a 25 shade eyeshadow palette, so to say I'm not nervous would be an understatement. I'm definitely nervous about this one, but this is another one. This is one that I definitely feel like I need to use in this capacity because I feel like the last time I used this, I wasn't as impressed with the quality as I typically am with the Glamlight formula. Now I will say I absolutely love that these, speaking of blues, I absolutely love the special blues in here, so I'm excited to reach for those. I remember not being like super impressed with the matte red and matte orange shades, but I'm very excited to reach for this. There's a lot of variety in here. There's a lot of different things that we can do. So that is palette number 1 rolling in. Then we got the Nars, it's actually the Stargaze palette, so not the Rising Star. This is what this palette looks like. We have 12 different shades in here, and I remember doing a look with this palette either at the tail end of last year or the very beginning of this year, where I used this really beautiful satin lavender shade all over the lids, and I really enjoyed that. I'm very excited about this one. I think the shades in this one that make me the most nervous are like this cranberry shade and then this shade right here, just because those aren't my favorite shades to reach for. But personally, I do really like the Nars formula, and I'm excited to reach into this. And then finally I rolled in, ooh, I think it was the Python, not the Jaguar. One moment. Okay, this one might be a little bit more difficult than not the Python, than the Jaguar, but I have the Huda Wild Python palette, which is pretty colorful, but there's blues, which I love. Honestly, like, I get, maybe it's like, okay, if we cover up these 2 shades right here, I feel like this is like a very fall appropriate palette, because when I think of fall, I think of like grungier, like I kind of think of like teals. We have neutral browns that I feel like I could use even for every day. We have a fun like green to gold shade, which I love a green to gold. We have blues, which I love. We have a fun neon like chartreusey sort of shade. I'm actually very excited about this. This is a palette that I meant to reach for this summer. This is a very neglected palette in my collection. But when I look at this, I look at it and it looks very fun. It's not something I look at, I'm like, I don't really want to use that. I just never think to reach for this. So I'm actually excited to roll this into this project, and that will be the 3rd and final palette rolling into this project. And as mentioned, as promised, I have for you my No Pan Left Behind palette. And if I know you guys, and I know the way you know how I like love my palettes and love my collection, I feel like many of you probably have already guessed that my Pan That palette is going to be the ABH Jackie Eyeshadow Palette. I was watching a Pan That palette update the other day and I was just like, ugh, I did not enjoy doing the Pan That palette project. But part of that was because I feel like I was putting a lot of pressure on myself. I was doing monthly updates and I was like, you know what? If I just am like, I want to track my progress, but I don't need to finish it in a year and I don't need to update every month, because what if I didn't use it that much that month? Then I feel like I would actually potentially enjoy doing this. And I feel like this is, when I think of like my favorite palette of all time, this is a palette that comes to mind just because I've talked about it so much. And I feel like in terms of just looks that I come back to so frequently, there are just some looks in there. Now, my one concern about this is I wish there was like one lighter matte shade, but also I can pair this with other palettes. I absolutely love the shade Soleil. I think that's such a pretty shadow, either on the lid or on the inner corner. And I feel like I can get so much use out of this as an inner corner. The shade Zam is this really beautiful, sparkly, bronzy gold shade that is just so pretty. I have, you know, matte warm browns that I absolutely love. I have the shade Sponsored, which is this really beautiful green shade. And then the other shades that I'm going to try and get a lot of use out of are Doulas, which I don't know that I'll get a ton of, like, we'll see about this shade. It is a little bit chunkier, a little bit flakier, and not my favorite. And then the shade Trust Issues is pretty, but again, just a little bit chunkier than I sometimes prefer. Now, the shades that I'm not putting any pressure on myself at all to finish are these 5 shades. So we have Supreme, Pinker, Big Wig, Wigglese, and then Shookington. Shookington I'm hoping I can get some use out of. I think that's a really beautiful purple, but these are just not shades I reach for that much. I know I have a pan in this, but that's because I was attempting to franken a shade. It did not go well. But my main focus are these 6 shades, this shade, and then these 2 shades on the end. And if I were to get my way through those shades, or through the majority of those shades, I think I would finally be ready to let this palette go. But at this moment, I could never see myself decluttering this palette because I have loved this palette so much. And this is the shade Zam. I wish they sold as a single. I love that shade so freaking much. So I'm actually really excited about this. I will film updates kind of as a separate video going forward. I just figured as an introduction, it's not gonna be that long, so I could just include it in this video. But as I mentioned, I plan to just do like bi-monthly updates or even quarterly updates, depending on how much I'm using this. Now, if I start this project and just off to the races, have a really good month, perhaps I will update at the beginning of October. I don't know, but I think plan for bi-monthly updates. I feel like that is going to feel like a proper amount of time for me to not feel like I have to use this every day but still have good progress. And I'm actually excited about this. I love this palette, so I'm excited to track using it, loving it even more, and just feeling a little bit better about getting rid of it when it's finally time. Like, this is definitely getting old, so I want to love it while I can still love it. And after that, you guys, that is going to wrap up and conclude today's video, my No Pan Left Behind update, as well as the introduction to a new Pan That palette. Would love to know if you are doing a Pan That palette. If you've ever tried to pan Jackie, let me know. I feel like this one is a little bit different than some of the other ABH palettes. Like, I feel like the shades have taken me longer to hit pan in these. So I feel like my experience panning this is definitely going to be different than my experience panning ABH Sultry. We'll see. But that is it for today's video. Thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch and for supporting me and my channel, as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I'll catch you in my next video. Bye.